Thank you very much for returning from coffee so quickly, and welcome to our second panel of the day today, which is on populism and democratic capitalism. So I'm Stephanie Rickard. I'm going to chair this session. I'm a professor here at the LSE, and I'm really privileged to welcome three excellent speakers to engage with this topic with us. It's an important topic because we've seen in recent years this real political opposition growing to both democracy and to capitalism. So in the United States, for example, we've seen the number of people who say capitalism is a positive thing decreased by 8 percentage points in the last 3 years. Only 36% of Americans say that capitalism provides an equal opportunities for success. So this is a real opposition or sort of discontent with capitalism and indeed with democracy. As in my shortness, so short. Thank you. So this trend that we're seeing, it's not just showing up in public opinion data in the United States, it's showing up in the electoral support and the vote share for populist candidates and political parties. And some of these parties have won so many votes that they've managed to get into government. And so that raises two questions for us to deal with. The first is, what's happened? Where has this come from? What are the causes of this growing discontent towards both capitalism, democratic capitalism, and democracy itself? And the second question is, what comes next? What can we do? What can mainstream political parties do? What can center governments do? What can businesses or firms do? And so all three of our speakers today have offered really concrete policy responses that governments can adopt to react to this growing discontent with democracy and with capitalism. Some of their suggestions overlap. Some of their suggestions really are quite different from one another. And in part, that differences stems from what they think is the cause of this growing opposition to democracy and capitalism. So we really have a nice setup for a very fruitful and lively discussion. And so I'll just briefly introduce our speakers in the order in which they're going to speak. So we'll start with Sheri Berman. She is a professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia University. Her research interests include the development of democracy and dictatorship, European politics, populism, fascism, and the history of the left. Her most recent book, Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, is really relevant for our discussion today, and she is widely published in a variety of locations. Ian Shapiro will be our second speaker. He is a professor at Yale University in political science. He has also written widely on democracy, justice, and methods of social inquiry. His most recent book, The Wolf at the Door, is focusing on the menace of economic security. So again, squarely on today's topic, and he offers some real concrete policy advice to how to address the economics of insecurity. And finally, we'll have Luigi Zingales. He is a professor at the University of Chicago in the Booth School of Business. He is the star of the podcast Capitalism, and his book Capitalism for the People, again, is directly on this topic of how can we make capitalism work for the people and try to address some of this discontent with capitalism and indeed with democracy. So we'll start with Sheri, and just please join me in welcoming them to the LSE.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Peter, and thank you all of us for hosting us at this wonderful conference, and thank you all for staying even though the weather looks to be improving somewhat. So I'm going to talk in conjunction with the sort of title of this panel on how capitalism is both a cause of populism, and by populism I'm talking particularly about the right-wing variety, and also how right-wing populism is a cause, or again, to use the terminology of this panel, an obstacle to dealing with capitalism's negative consequences, reforming capitalism, that is. So let me start with the first. So some scholars and observers link capitalism directly with populism. They see it as a direct cause of populism. And the argument here is, I'm sure, very familiar to everyone in the room. It's that economic grievances stemming from things like globalization, we talked about this in an early panel, rising inequality, increasing precarity, the fallout from austerity, all of these things lie behind the growing support for anti-establishment right-wing populist parties, particularly, obviously, I'm thinking about in Europe and the United States. Now, there are several problems with this explanation. The most obvious one, however, is that populists don't focus on or mobilize around economic grievances. Really, what they mobilize around, what they emphasize are social and cultural grievances. So these kinds of explanations that link capitalism directly with the rise of these kind of anti-establishment populist, populist parties, they leave unexplained this disjuncture between the causes of populism and what populism is really appealing to, what its kind of nature is. So then we have other scholars and observers, and this view I would say is particularly popular in the US. And these kind of people focus on those social and cultural grievances stemming from things like rising immigration, the mobilization of various minority groups, and for them that is really the key cause of populism. Now, this explanation is better in the sense that it does link populism's causes with its nature and appeal. But the problem here is that it actually doesn't fit the data very well at all. Doesn't fit the data comparatively. So if you look, for instance, at levels of racism and xenophobia in particular countries, and then you look at support for right-wing populist parties, there's actually very little correlation. So you have countries that score relatively low on things like racism and xenophobia, Sweden, for instance, but yet have very, very electorally strong populist parties. And then you have other countries where racism and xenophobia is actually quite high, based on, sort of panel questions and things like that, and actually support for populist parties is relatively low. Southern European countries like Spain and Portugal, Ireland, things like that. Historically and temporally, there's also very little correlation. So despite the fact that we hear much more about these social and cultural grievances, if you look across the West, things like racism and xenophobia have declined gradually, certainly not as much as we'd like, but gradually and consistently over the last decades. This is true, by the way, of all socioeconomic groups, all educational groups, all occupational groups. This is true. However, over the past 15 years or so, the degree to which these types of attitudes have declined has differed dramatically. So there's been a consistent decline, but more highly educated groups have seen these kinds of attitudes decline much, much more dramatically. And therein lies part of the story. I will get back to that. The best kind of explanations for populism, therefore, mix the insights of these two different kinds of explanations, right? And the focus here is on how the negative consequences of capitalism facilitate or create an opportunity to increase the salience of social and cultural grievances and racial and ethnic identities. This explanation is much better than the other two, but there's still, I want to argue, a piece of the puzzle missing here. Changes in issue salience, shifts in identities do not happen on their own. They do not happen just as a result of economic change, okay? Let me stop for a second and just clarify a couple of terms here, although probably most of you are familiar with them. The first is this word salience, which I've used already more than once, right? So there is a very important difference between preferences and salience. So voters have opinions or preferences on a whole variety of issues, right? That's what public opinion data tells you. But most of these opinions, most of these preferences don't matter when they actually choose to vote for a populist or some other kind of political party. If parties don't appeal to these preferences, if they don't offer significantly different options on those preferences, voters cannot vote on the basis of them. So salience is simply a way of measuring whether or not certain kinds of preferences or opinions are prioritized by voters. The second is identity formation. Everyone, all of us in this room, all people, belong to many different groups, racial groups, class groups, religious groups, national groups, right? But at any particular time, we do not identify equally with all of these groups, right? Who you identify with, which groups you identify most with, depends on the context that you are in, the type of conflicts that you are subjected to, whether those conflicts are primarily redistributional, ethnic, cultural, the way people are messaged and mobilized by different collective actors. All of these things matter in determining which groups you identify most with. So to use a term that might be, or terms that might be familiar to many people in this room, identities are not given, they are made. Or if you prefer your terminology in Marxist terms, there's a difference between the class structure and class formation. All right, so if you want to understand the sort of causal pathway from capitalism's problems and economic grievances to the increasing salience of social and cultural grievances and the activation of racial and ethnic identities, to the rising support for populism, examining political parties is really crucial. Now, we know that right-wing populists really strive to increase the salience of social and cultural issues and to get voters to focus on their racial and ethnic identities. Indeed, in the political science literature, there is a general finding that parties of the right work particularly hard to focus on these things in times of economic crisis. This is not just true of populists, although they do this very specifically. This is true of parties of the right more generally. What I want to argue, though, is that left parties have really played an important role in this dynamic as well. Beginning in the 1990s, of course, you're all here in Britain, you know this very well, there was an economic convergence that happens between the left and the right. That is to say, voters have less to choose on because the parties of the economic platforms of left and right-wing parties converge. This economic convergence is also accompanied by a shift in the kind of messaging that parties of the left engage in. There is much less emphasis on class, and therefore, again, much less messaging to voters about this particular type of identity. This results in a kind of brand dilution, right? It changes the way many voters view what parties of the left stand for, what they're trying to do, who they are championing. And what we see starting in the 1990s, therefore, is an acceleration. These trends began earlier, but an acceleration in voter de-alignment, particularly in Europe, right? So diminishing party membership, increasing electoral volatility, and growing abstention by voters, particularly low-educated, low-income voters. In fact, in Britain, for example, the differences in voter participation are greater between classes than they are in who they vote for. That is to say, low-income, low-educated voters vote so much less than people from other groups that that difference is even greater than the difference in how they vote. Now, this creates an opportunity for right-wing populists who had existed before this time to capture the growing numbers of unattached and alienated voters. And they do this very successfully. They do this successfully by appealing to social and cultural issues because, as I mentioned before, there is this gap that opens up by this time between the values, the attitudes, the preference of educated middle-class voters and lower-income, low-educated voters, and also by moderating their economic programs. We see this very clearly in Europe, that right-wing populist parties, starting in the early aughts, begin to shift their economic appeals from sort of Thatcherite, Reaganite kind of programs very much to what is sometimes referred in shorthand as welfare nationalism. And these changes in the appeals and the messages and the policy profiles of parties of the left and right help explain why we begin to see from this time also the growing salience of social and cultural issues and the prioritization of racial and ethnic identity. So I originally had a PowerPoint. One of the points would have showed you a chart showing how much different parties emphasize these things. And you can see, you know, during the post-war decades, political competition really pivoted around economic policy, economic differences. But starting again in the 1990s and accelerating during the first decade of the 20th century, it shifted a little bit in the last years, you begin to see social and cultural issues much more at the center of political conversation, much more at the center of political competition. And this is where right-wing populism shifts from being a consequence of capitalism to a cause of our inability, I think, to fully deal with its negative consequences. And it does this in two ways. First, as I've already mentioned, because it keeps citizens' attention focused on social and cultural grievances and racial and ethnic identities rather than economic issues and class identities. In fact, for those of you who study European politics, right-wing populists have now succeeded in even turning things like environmentalism into a cultural issue rather than a cultural and an economic issues, right? Anybody who focuses on German politics in particular, it's incredible. Environmentalism has now been turned into a thing that is a cultural issue because it's favored by certain kinds of groups. And in these kind of situations, political actors have less incentive and less ability to prioritize economic reform, because that's just not where voters are. Second, this kind of political competition makes it much more difficult for the left to win electorally. Now, the assumption I'm working on here is that parties of the left are the ones with the greatest incentive to deal with capitalism's negative consequences. We could debate that. I'm going to throw that out there as an assumption. And the problem is when voters are focused on social and cultural grievances and racial and ethnic identities, it's very difficult for mainstream parties of the left to put together a coalition, or it's more difficult to put together a coalition of middle class and working class voters. It's also more difficult in proportional representation systems to put together a left coalition more generally, because when the focus is on social and cultural grievances and racial and ethnic identities, the left loses a lot of voters to the populist right. Does not lose them to other left parties, right? And middle class educated voters, if they shift from, sort of social democratic parties, they shift to green parties and new left parties, so those voters are still on the left. But when the focus is on these other issues and identities, you lose a lot of your potential left-wing voters to the right, which makes left coalitions, majority coalitions, really, really very difficult. So if the goal, as I understood sort of one of the framework questions for this panel is to figure out what are the conditions that we need to get a major push to reform contemporary capitalism, I would say that one thing that we need is really to be able to shift voters' attention back to economic grievances and class identities. And again, class identities can change over time, right? They can be based now on things like precariousness and insecurity, because those are the main problems of capitalism today as opposed to what they would have been a couple of generations ago. Now, this would do a bunch of things I think that would be beneficial. Again, working on my assumption, I think it makes it much easier to build majority coalitions on the left. It also would potentially weaken right-wing populist parties, because what drives their voters together are these, again, social and cultural issues. They are very divided. Generally, right-wing populist voters are on economic issues. They tend to be, again, coalitions of sort of, low-income, low-educated voters, small business people, and things like that. So, again, the more focus you have on economic issues, the more tensions there are within right-wing populism, less tensions within the left. And I think that, again, if we really want to think about how to reform capitalism, in addition to the great economic ideas and other kinds of ideas we need to do that Professor Esamoglu talked about last night and some of my colleagues talked about this morning, right? Ideas without political champions, political parties, civil society organizations, those ideas can remain footnotes to history, right? They have to be championed by political actors and other actors if they're going to become actual policy outcomes. And so in order to have that happen, as I said, I think we really need to focus on how do we diminish support for these right-wing populist parties and also perhaps increase support for the left. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheri. Next up, we have Ian. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
We all have our 15 minutes at some point, so this is mine. I'm delighted to be back at the LSE to talk about this important subject. And I do want to take a minute to compliment the organizers on the choice of title, because I do think that one of the things we've paid insufficient attention to in recent decades, with all the focus on inequality and particularly the top 1% and so forth, we haven't paid enough attention to insecurity. And obviously the two are related, but they're very different. And even relatively middle-class people in the economy can feel and be motivated by high levels of insecurity. So I think its focus on insecurity is spot on. I'm principally going to talk about politics today, but I do want to begin, and I will return to the fact that underlying everything that's going on is for sure the big structural changes in the capitalist economies, with the transition to service economies, with the after effects of globalization. We're now in an era of deep globalization, but we're still living with the effects of globalization and related strains that are on all of these systems, as Anna Marie was intimating, with aging populations and changing dependency ratios, massive new demographic pressures on welfare states everywhere. And a lot of these issues are coming home to roost in ways that I think many elites didn't anticipate in many countries, in many political systems. I'm also going to focus, reference being made to my recent book about policies, but I'll talk some about that, but I'm principally going to be talking about politics for the same reason that Sheri Berman was talking about politics, because you can't really think about what policies, if you don't think about the politics as well, you're kind of shouting at the wind with respect to the policies, because you have to also think about the ways in which the policies and the politics interact. And I also think it's important to think about what's going on in different types of democratic systems, for two reasons. One is I think there's a tendency always to think the grass is greener somewhere else. And a lot of people in two-party systems say, of course, what we need is PR and multi-party systems. But you have to look at how these same dynamics are playing out in multi-party systems before you want to necessarily jump on that particular bandwagon, because the underlying structural economic changes are affecting all of these countries and playing out somewhat differently politically because of the different electoral systems that they have. So I would emphasize, before jumping into the politics, a couple of points about the economic insecurity. The first is that we've gone from a world in which somebody would have graduated from either their high school or college education, worked for one employer for their lifetime, and then retired, to a world in which people finishing their initial education today must expect to change jobs 12 to 15 times in their working lifetime. It's a completely different world. And maybe 2 or 3 of those jobs are in their early 20s, college jobs and so forth. But even once they are full-time employees, they're going to be changing jobs often. Now, this doesn't really matter for people on the right side of the technology revolution, people who are graduating from elite institutions and perhaps working as consultants or at a McKinsey or somewhere for a few years, or doing a few startups, going back to business school, networking more, moving into other things while building up nest eggs of investments. For those people, it's just, opportunity after opportunity. But that is not where most people are. For most people, they're going from jobs with good benefits to jobs with fewer benefits to jobs with no benefits, from full-time employment to part-time employment to intermittent employment, and very much going down the occupational ladder, and most importantly, I think, for how they behave politically, down the social status ladder, going from jobs where they had a lot of esteem and recognition and felt like valued members of society, to jobs where they are almost embarrassed by the jobs that they have and become disaffected, angry, and alienated. I think a good recent book that captures a lot of how this is now not just blue collar, but creeping up. Creeping maybe is too slow a word because it's getting such a boost from AI, but up the social order is Dan Markowitz's book, The Meritocracy Trap, which talks about the hollowing out of middle classes and the growing insecurity of them. But here's another statistic that makes the same point in a different way. If you think about the income of Trump primary voters in 2016, not general election voters in a two-party system where there's only one choice, but primary voters, when there were 16 choices, 1/3 of them had a family income of less than $50,000. That's the median income for a family of four then. 1/3 were between 50 and 100,000, and 1/3 were above 100,000. So 2/3 of those voters were actually above the median income, but not the very rich. And so it's just another way of capturing the population that feels insecure and threatened, and that their children's prospects are not going to be as good as their own, is very big. It's a lot of the middle class. Okay, how does this play out politically? I'm going to talk about multi-party systems first, and then I'm going to talk about two-party systems. The big story in multi-party systems is fragmentation of parties. Fragmentation, we have a data set now looking at all OECD countries over 60 years, and it's been going on gradually, but it's been accelerating in the last 15 years or so. And the number of parties in the parliaments just about everywhere has been growing. And if you want to get some sense of the dynamic of this, the fragmentation has been most obvious and most pronounced with left-of-center parties, where old social democratic parties that used to come in first or second on a regular basis in elections now come in fourth or fifth. They are much less strongly supported by their traditional constituencies. And you might say, why? Well, Sheri intimated one of the reasons, which is with the rise of neoliberalism, which didn't begin with the collapse of communism. It began in the 80s, really, but it certainly accelerated after the end of communism. The economic policies that the left-of-center parties felt compelled to offer were basically the same. They were just trying to show they could run these economies just as well as the right-of-center parties. And the way this, I think, has played out is that their traditional constituencies have felt abandoned by them, that the employed working class, connected to unions, has been shrinking as the unionized sectors of these labor forces have been shrinking. And so the left-of-center parties have been defending a shrinking constituency and also less well, because as these parties have gotten smaller, they've had less leverage. And so they began to hemorrhage voters. So say in a country like Germany, they would be hemorrhaging voters to Die Linke, to the Greens, and eventually to the AfD. And fragmentation on the left tends to beget fragmentation on the right. So as Angela Merkel senses that there are voters out there that she could pick up, she moves towards the center to pick some of them up, and that creates a space on her right for the emergence, for the strengthening of the Free Democrats and the emergence of the AfD. So I think that is a phenomenon that occurs on many of these systems. And since we're talking about Germany, the 2021 election is the first time it took 3 parties to form a government. And you start to see the pathologies and the sclerosis that informs multi-party governments, particularly when they're not ideologically adjacent parties. And so you now have the Social Democrats trying to manage this government that consists of the Free Democrats and the Greens. The Greens are insisting on a green agenda. The Free Democrats are insisting on austerity. And so you get things like these mandates to change your household heating and cooling systems, the so-called heat pumps, which cannot be fully subsidized by the government because the Free Democrats won't let the government do it, producing huge backlash, particularly but not only in the East. So if you look at in the last elections, the AfD had fallen to 10%. If you look at what's happening in regional elections now, they're picking up a lot more. And if the opinion polls that just from the last month show that the AfD is now 21%. If there were an election in Germany tomorrow, they would be the second biggest party in the Bundestag. They're way ahead of the Social Democrats, who are sort of wringing their hands, unable to really manage this government. And so it's a sort of, everyone used to think Germany had the sweet spot for the greatest, most well-functioning European system. It doesn't look so pretty today. If we think a little bit for a few minutes about two-party systems, how am I for time? Okay. If we think about two-party systems, the big story here is weakening of parties, and particularly making them susceptible to populist takeovers. And this has a number of sources. One is calls for much more internal party democracy, which is totally understandable because people who feel the parties aren't serving them, their impulse to say we need to grab control of these parties and make sure that they start to listen to us. And so you had much more membership participation, for example, in the selection of leaders. And you get, say in Britain, the bastion of strong parties for so long. You get the developments in the Labour Party where, a couple of decades ago, the Parliamentary Labour Party would pick the leader of the Labour Party. We're now in a world where the membership, 450,000 voters, pick the leader, and you can get a situation where the membership can elect Jeremy Corbyn, who's way to the left of the median Labour voter, and never mind the median British voter. The Parliamentary Labour Party can pass a vote of no confidence in by 172 to 40, and the membership re-elects him by 62%. So clearly this is a great weakening of the Labour Party, and he leads them to one electoral mess and one electoral wipeout before they managed to get rid of him. Could tell similar stories elsewhere. Then a second big source of weakening parties is the increased reliance on referendums. And this unbundles issues and enables the apparent contradictions that produce Brexit when it's presented as a single issue matter without voters having to confront the opportunity cost of their choices and the externalities of their choices by just saying, we don't want to be governed from Brussels. But it's a little like telling a child they can eat all the sweets that they want without attention to the stomach aches that are going to come later, or the costs imposed on everyone else is going to have to listen to them complaining when they say, oh, I wish we hadn't left the EU after all. So there are a lot of reasons why single issue decision making is bad, and I'm happy to talk more about that if people want me to. But it greatly weakens parties because it gives parties a way of avoiding bundling issues and instead responding to the intense pressure that comes from single issue voters. The poster child for this is Proposition 13 in California in 1978, which started the anti-tax movement, which limited taxation on all real estate to 1%. It was the sort of starve the beast philosophy of starve the government of money. But of course, that never works because programs like Social Security and Medicare are too popular. So when Republicans are in power, they just borrow rather than tax in order to pay for such things. And that's now going on at the national level. I wanted to talk briefly about primaries. So the issue, it's a good example of how parties become weakened. The US has had primaries for 120 years. That's nothing new about primaries. But what's changed is the number of safe seats, which has steadily increased, particularly in the last 15, 20 years. And that's been due to a variety of factors. Partisan gerrymandering, when state legislatures draw the districts to favor their party. Bipartisan gerrymandering, when they make deals to carve up the states. Just natural demographic sorting, blue cities in red states, that sort of thing is also affecting it. As Sheri said, often the left contributes to increasing the salience of identity politics without maybe fully realizing the consequences. One way that's played out in the US is majority and minority districts, which also creates more and more safe seats. And so you have 85% of the seats now in Congress are safe seats, where the only thing that matters is the primary. And you have very low turnout of primary voters and you get voters principally on the extremes of the parties showing up. So this greatly empowers the right wing of the Republican Party and the left wing of the Democratic Party. It's much more of a problem on the Republican side simply because there are more Republican safe seats, about a third more Republican safe seats than Democratic safe seats, and about a third more Republican safe states in the Senate than Democratic safe states in the Senate. So this is why the Freedom Caucus are more powerful on the Republican side than the Progressive Caucus are on the Democratic side. So these problems are showing up in different ways where you have two-party systems. The mechanism by which populist candidates and anti-system candidates infiltrate the political order is in this way. And by the way, it happens at the presidential level too, that it's a bigger problem on the Republican side. That's why Trump could succeed in a hostile takeover of the Republicans, and Bernie Sanders didn't make a lot of trouble for Hillary, but he couldn't actually succeed on the Democratic side. So it is these structural factors in the electoral systems that lead them to play it out in this way. So what is to be done? We are asked to speak to that question. I would come back to where we started. It is the economy stupid, and the big thing that has to be done is, again, here I'm just agreeing with my predecessor on this panel, that left of center parties have to realize it's in their interest to return to economic campaigning, and that they need to understand that they're playing into the hands of right of center parties to the extent that they play into identity politics. I think that the Biden administration, I have a lot of criticisms of them, particularly with respect to the topic of the first panel, but actually it's, you know, they're the first Democratic administration since the Johnson administration that are really trying to rebuild what we used to think of as the Great Society Coalition, the pre-neoliberal turn of the Democratic Party. And if you look at their policy agenda, it really is aimed at trying to address long-term economic insecurity. He's not the greatest messenger, and so he's in a precarious spot, but at least they are trying to do the right thing. The remedies for the politics, I think, are pretty obvious. In multi-party systems, to try and reverse or contain the fragmentation with increased thresholds, pre-election coalitions, those sorts of things. And in two-party systems, or where parties are weak, doing things to strengthen them. De-emphasize the importance of primaries. I have various proposals for that. And I think one of them, if we're looking for, I'll end with this, more promising developments rather than just gloom and doom, it is encouraging in the US that a third of the states now, actually more than a third, 21, 22 states, have moved to so-called independent commissions for redistricting. So I think trying to get rid of primaries in America is hopeless. But getting redistricting away from the state legislatures is a start. The problem is half of them aren't really independent commissions. They're bipartisan, in which case they just carve up the states and replicate the problem. And even when they're independent, they tend to be given the wrong criteria. So they're told, like, don't split up neighborhoods. Well, that's exactly what they should do. They should split up neighborhoods. You know, the ideal world would be one where every district had urban, suburban, and rural voters in it. But it is a start, and it's a move in the right direction. And so, I've probably exceeded my time already. I could talk more about other things that might be done at the margin, at least, to nudge things in a better direction. But thank you.
So I have to say I'm very honored and humbled to be here. Honored because it's a great group of people, and humbled because it's a bunch of political scientists, and this is a political science topic, and I'm just an economist. Now, they help me greatly because they move the conversation in the direction of economics, which is the stuff I know, and not the rest, which I know much, much less. I'm also honored because Stephanie was kind enough to mention my book. In 2012, I wrote a book, Capitalism for the People, with a very simple idea that there is a tension between capitalism and democracy. There is a tension because capitalists tend to favor inequality in order to provide incentives, and democracy tends to reduce that inequality, in fact, redistribute at some level. However, I say that this tension is very healthy, because without democracy, capitalists tend to drift very quickly into an oligarchy. A capitalist system is a system, when at its best, a system where everything is for sale except the rules themselves. But of course, that's very difficult, because if everything is for sale, then also the rules start to become for sale. And what we've seen in the last 3 decades in the United States and around the world, that the rules have become for sale. And that has been a degeneration of capitalism into an oligarchy where the pendulum too much in the right direction. Now, my biggest mistake is that I wrote this book in 2012. And by the way, one of the chapters of that book was it's time for populism, and then the only question is which kind of populism we're going to get. Okay? Unfortunately, I wrote the book in 2012 when actually Romney had a chance to become president of the United States. Do you remember that? This seems like a prehistory. Romney could become now he cannot even be senator of Utah these days, and he could be president of the United States. And of course, the book was ignored at the time. But unfortunately, my prediction were true, even like more than I myself expected, and unfortunately for all of us in the most negative way, because nobody picked up my hope. My hope at the time was that you use this resentment to actually clean up capitalism, not to destroy it. And of course, we're not seeing that. Now, why I was a bit ahead of the time, not because I'm smart, but simply because I'm a financial economist. And the great financial crisis was ground zero for that. Not only why it happened, but also the reaction to it was unbelievably a representation of a world in which the interests of the few were very well protected and the interest of the many ignored. And that's really is the source of distortion. I'm also a little bit different because I don't consider populism is a bad word. Maybe it's because of my classical studies, but you know, democracy is governed of the people. Demos is people, and populism is just a Latin version of it. So there is not really a reason for why this should be considered something necessarily negative. In fact, I think it goes to the root of what we consider democracy. And many people, especially in the United States, identify democracy as simply free and fair elections. So you have free and fair election, then the day after the election, every member of parliament is bought off by a few people. That's democracy. But according to this version, absolutely, because the elections are free, they're not exposed you by people, but so what? That's part of the system. The other version is that actually democracy is somewhat a representation of the will of the people. And in fact, because of my classical study, I remember the famous speech that Pericles gave for the first year of the Peloponnesian War, for the death of the first year of the Peloponnesian War. And actually what is interesting, in that speech, the translation is different, because some translation, they say, we call democracy what is the administration in the hands of the many and not of the few. And other translations say the administration favors the many instead of the few. Okay? Now, if you know a little bit of ancient Greeks, it's very easy to have a different interpretation because it's a very flexible language. But I think that in the translation, there is all the difference in the world. What do we consider democracy? Is something that is simply governed by the many, at least give everybody a chance, or is something that is governed in the interest of the many? I think that that's the reason why I think that populism might have a positive dimension. Also because I don't identify populism as necessarily a right-wing populist. The People's Party in the United States was not right-wing. And in my own country, Italy, the Five-Star Movement defies really sort of the left-right dimension, but is, I don't think, can be considered a right-wing populist. And in fact, is precisely because of the defeat of the Five-Star Movement that now we have the real populists, in fact, the real fascists in government in Italy. I think that the other thing that differentiates me is that I think that populism in the negative term exists only to the extent exists elitism. In order for the people to say, we feel out, there need to be an identification of what we are we and what they are them. And this only exists when the them are very well characterized. So in a world with a high mobility of income, but also political position, etc., I think it's more difficult to make a distinction between us and them. In a world in which the elite is very sort of restricted and not very mobile, I think it's very easy to make this distinction. And I think in the United States, we live in that world in which there is a coastal elite, and even if I live in Chicago, I consider Chicago a coastal city because we have the lake. So the coastal elite is dominating and look down to the rest of the people. The sense is, oh, if we're just left alone, all the political issue will be resolved by our technocracy, not understanding that there is an important element of interest and distribution, and so they shift this under the rug as there is no issue of redistribution, but in fact, they redistribute from the many to the few in name of a technocratic government. And of course, there is an element of racism, but racism not based on race, but based on kind of a contempt toward the people, in the sense the term deplorable say it all. And I agree with Sheri that we should emphasize economic issues, but as an economist, I know economics, the biggest principle of economics is actually the budget constraint, okay? And so the budget constraints say if you should emphasize something, you should de-emphasize something else, okay? Because there is a budget constraint. So the left should not only emphasize economic issue, should de-emphasize what emphasized today, which is issues of gender and race as primarily issue of the party. I think we should take a page of all people from the Italian Communist Party after World War II. Everybody, the elite was absolutely formed by atheists in a Catholic country. They never emphasized atheism because in a Catholic country, if you want to win an election, you don't have to go against the people. Okay? And so, yes, they were atheists, but they were not making the essential program is to eradicate the Catholic religion from Italy. And going that way, they almost won elections, and certainly they influenced very much all the event in after World War II, thanks to their political strength. Okay? So I think that it is incumbent upon the left to abandon or de-emphasize certain issues, to emphasize the economic issues. And I know this is difficult because there is an entire political elite in the left that grew up ignoring that. They are basically the children of the elite that went to the elite Ivy Leagues, and they feel empowered to be leftists because they discuss about the latest issue of LGBTQ, ignoring the problems of the reality. I have a stepdaughter who came home once and was discussing about the fight at her school, and they were fighting about where to go to the bathroom. And I said, you know, there was a generation that fought for civil rights. There was a generation that fought not to fight a wrong war in Vietnam. Your generation is fighting to where to go to the bathroom, okay? Did not go down very well at the beginning, but to the credit of my stepdaughter, a few weeks later, he was arguing my position against her sister, and a few months later said, you know, you cannot say those things because you're white, you're male, and you're even straight. So forget it, you have no right to say any of these things. However, you're not completely wrong, okay? So I think that it is very important, this, because I think that it's not only capitalism as risk. 20 years ago, I wrote a book with Raghu Rajan that was Saving Capitalism from the Capitalist. But I think that now what to be saved, even more than capitalism itself, is democracy. And needs to be saved not only from the right-wing populists, of course needs to be saved by them, but also need to be also saved from the left-wing technocrat who at some point, because the people don't vote the way we want, we should somehow restrict the vote of the people. I think that, unfortunately, I hear progressively more and more people from the left that get disgruntled with the fact that, you know, we are smart, we know what is the right thing, and we don't win election. So what do? Some say we should get rid of election. Certainly in Europe, no matter what you vote, the outcome is the same because it's decided, centralized in Frankfurt by an elite of technocrats, regardless of what people vote. And the consequences are that people get more and more disaffected. So in Italy, the first version of disaffection was a populist from the center left. And that populist got confronted by the hate of the entire elite. I think that I am the only Italian of a certain intellectual status that was not contemptuous vis-à-vis the five-star movement. Okay? Now, you can say a lot of things. They made a lot of mistakes, unlike the others. But the level of contempt you saw in the press, in every organization, was like above belief. Above belief if you don't have a view of history, because the People's Party in the United States received exactly the same treatment by the newspaper of the time that were all owned by the oligarchs of the time. So that was a real threat, okay? But if you fight that threat, what you get are the real fascists. So what I think we need to fight now is to understand how to prevent that the disruption that globalization and capitalism brought not only bring us sort of some healthy response on the democratic side, but brings a drift into fascism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luigi. You gave us a lot to talk about, a lot to think about. Thank you to all of you. I'm sure there's lots of questions. I'm just going to take the liberty of starting off with a first question, and it's for all of you. Is there a role for compensation? Can the government compensate people who have lost from the current system, who are feeling economically insecure, who are in left behind places, who feel left behind, who feel discontent? Is there a role for the government to try to compensate these people to assuage the discontent? Luigi, I know you've argued for a pro-market populism. Is there a role for compensation in pro-market populism? Ian, I've heard you argue for universal adjustment assistance, so maybe that's a form of compensation that you think might work. And Sheri, can compensation do anything if it's really the salient issue is about identity politics? So I'll open that up to all of you or any of you that would like to speak.
So let me answer very simply, yes. There is plenty of opportunities. The question is what forms it takes. So, for example, in the United States, universal health care is an obvious thing that will make an enormous difference and is block for vested interests that block the implementation of that. But that would be the perfect form of assistance, because it's universal and because hopefully does not have any condescending aspect to it. I actually, and I know this might sound strange, especially from somebody coming from Chicago, but I think that when it comes to, for example, the displacement of workers, especially after the so-called China shock, I think that, of course, you want some assistance in terms of unemployment insurance, but I think that in some cases we need to slow down the process rather than just assistance, because it's more than just assistance. The word assistance itself is the meaning, and the last thing we want to do is be condescending. And, you know, we want to give you the crumbs of the system because we don't want you to complain, but for the rest, we can keep doing what is we were doing anyway.
Thanks.
Yes, I think there is a role for compensation, and I certainly agree with building up things like universal health care. The difficulty is starting from where we are now, that you have most people getting their health care through employers. I think it's got, in my book, The Wolf at the Door, I make the case that it's going to become easier to build a coalition for that because more and more people are losing their health insurance or finding it less and less good as it becomes increasingly expensive for them. And propose a mechanism that would avoid the sticker shock of adding multiple trillions of dollars to the economy overnight by the idea is most people have health insurance until the age of 26 through their parents. So give it to from 26 to 35-year-olds first, because young people don't get sick. And so it greatly changes the sticker shock of what Sanders or Elizabeth Warren were running on. And then they won't want to lose it. And also allow people to buy into it as they become dissatisfied. So mechanisms like that. The general point I would make, though, is that I think that more important than just compensating people who are harmed by globalization or technology is to help them adjust to the new order. Because if you have, one thing the unemployment statistics conceal in a country like the US is people who've left the labor market. And many of the most expensive people that aren't captured in the statistics, in increasing numbers, they go on to things like Social Security disability insurance. And once you go on that, you never really come off it. And so if you have a 45-year-old going on to Social Security disability insurance, the deadweight economic loss of that, never mind the opportunity cost of somebody who could be retrained and go back to the workforce, is enormous. And so Stephanie was referring to our argument for universal adjustment assistance. The U.S. has a terribly dysfunctional system of trade adjustment assistance that goes all the way back to the Kennedy administration, which was never adequately funded, and it was just a tragedy of errors, what a mess it was. But really, including arguing endlessly about, well, what about people who didn't lose their jobs to trade? And in the world we live in today, people increasingly are losing their jobs to technology anyway. So the issue shouldn't be how you lose your job, but can you be retrained to re-enter the economy in a new form? And the Americans have been terrible at this, but some European countries have been pretty good. I think the Danes are probably the state of the art here. But clearly it's an idea whose time is going to have to come if you want to reduce the overall insecurity that people are trying to manage.
Can I add a point? Mm-hmm. So, of course, I'm in favor of retraining, but honestly, if you are a manufacturer worker at age 45 or 50, you're not going to be trained to be a web designer the next day.
No, but
and honestly, even becoming a nurse is challenging.
Yeah.
So the question is, maybe what we should think about is what is the opportunity cost of relocating these people. And it says, most of the time, and we economists have been responsible for that, most of the time we think of that, what is the problem if you shed workforce because they're going to be employed somewhere else? However, that somewhere else is at a fraction of the previous wage. So there is an enormous loss that these people are facing. So I think in thinking about the movement and the restructuring, we need to think about this cost.
Yeah, fair enough. But there are going to be, many blue-collar tasks in the green energy economy, in rebuilding infrastructure, in building windmills, and maintaining all of these things. I mean, it's not as if manual labor is going to be going away. Those people could do a lot of these things.
No, but the green cars, the electric cars, require a third of the workforce of the traditional cars. So this is not solved very clearly, but the green economy is an economy for unemployment for the former auto workers.
So Luigi, are you arguing for universal basic income?
No, I'm arguing for factoring in, and I'm not necessarily against universal basic income. I think that what I find it particularly sort of negative is the fact that in this way you feel entitled to do everything because you have a payment. I think that assistance is necessary. I think thinking more seriously about what are the costs of what we're doing. So I'm in favor of the green economy, but let's recognize that this is going to be majorly disruptive for a large group of people, and telling them they can retrain themselves at age 50 is not going to happen. So these people are going to be unemployed, their family were going to be disrupted. So we need to think, maybe we need to do more traditional construction work, but every time you put some cement, you create greenhouse gases. So I think it's very easy to talk green economy when we are the flying class that, by the way, I discovered, you know, that the only thing that doesn't pay any tax is the kerosene for the planes is tax-free. It is tax-free. So we, elite, we fly on the plane and we don't pay taxes, and the workers, let's take another tax because we want to reduce the CO2 emissions.
I want to bring Sheri back in.
I feel like there's not all that much left to say. I mean, certainly I don't think anybody in this room doesn't think that compensation is a good idea, and that compensation should not just be traditional welfare state policies that help people who are suffering, but also help them to adjust in whatever ways that are possible. Sometimes that can be subsidies to move. Sometimes, where relevant, that can be subsidies to retrain. But that clearly can't be the only thing that governments do, right? I mean, governments, and I think that's why we're all here, also have to be thinking about the nature of the system that is producing a growing need for compensation, right? If you want to solve a problem, you don't just want to deal with its symptoms, you want to deal with the underlying causes, which is a capitalism that is out of whack. And I think this actually brings you back a little bit to this morning's panel, which is, I do not see what we are very gradually tiptoeing towards now as a return to economic nationalism or a swing from one extreme to the other. I see what we are tiptoeing back towards is something that is a less coherent version of what anyone who had a brain recognized was necessary in the West after 1945 and the catastrophes of the Great Depression and the interwar years, was that governments have a responsibility to manage capitalism in ways that do not create winners and losers, that do not create people who feel so economically aggrieved that they are willing to vote for parties that scapegoat whoever the minority of the time is, right? That, to my mind, I mean, neoliberalism is a big term, right? But perhaps at the fundamental heart of that is what we see as the correct relationship between governments and markets, between states and capitalism. After 1945, even folks in the United States recognized, hey, wait a second, maybe out of control capitalism is a bad thing politically and socially. Maybe governments have a responsibility to tame capitalism so that we don't create huge numbers of disaffected, alienated citizens. I think we are gradually tiptoeing back to that after the financial crisis. I think that is where the emphasis has to lie, in addition to compensating those who are being left behind.
Thank you, Sheri. I'd like to open it up now to questions. Oh, we have a lot. Good. Maybe this individual in the white button-down shirt here on the aisle.
Testing. Thanks. I think the white button-down shirt is going to be germane to my question. Because, I mean, I was struck by a certain amount of agreement on the panel about left-wing or center-left parties in particular moving away from identity appeals to economic appeals. That makes perfect sense to me. But Professor Zingales actually touched on one concept of identity, which is an elite identity. And an elite identity not characterized so much by concentration of wealth, although that's very important, but by education. Now, I only attend these discussions at elite educational institutions dedicated to creating more elites and a certain way of looking at the world, well, not so much looking at the world, but looking at one's position in the world as based on that kind of elite establishment. It's cultural more than economic, I think, and I have no answer to it. But it does seem to be driving a lot of the resentment, and I wonder if the panelists could talk about that.
I can talk for the United States. England is very different, and I don't claim to know anything about it. But in the United States, I think that the system of financing and education has really created a huge divide because only a few people can really afford to go to the top Ivy League schools. And then there are a bunch of fellowship and etc. for a few very poor people that are very bright. And then there is a hole in the middle that is completely excluded from the Ivy League university. They can go to very decent state universities, so I'm not saying they are sort of not privy of the education, but they live in a very different world. And to me, that's part of the reason why at elite university, they feel the need to find something else to discuss, because if they are looking at themselves, they say, we are a bunch of privilege and we should change this privilege. And so that's the reason why they try to find new dimension in which they feel minorities, even if they are the most privileged people in the world. And that's the problem, I think that we need to break this in some way, but I have no idea how to do it, because I think we price ourselves out of existence for most people. So I think that that's a very serious problem.
You want to weigh in?
Sure.
Go ahead.
So I agree with the spirit of the question, but I do think the elite is basically self-identifies primarily in economic terms. I think the way in which they poured so much fuel on the current alienated politics was the way, not just in the US, but certainly in the US, the way in which elites responded to the financial crisis, basically by protecting themselves and bailing out the banks and doing relatively little for in the US, the 20 million people who were kicked out of their homes. And if you look at the loss of employment in the 2, 3, 4, 5 years afterwards, and the loss of resources and savings after the financial crisis, the people at the top came back very quickly, and the difference, the people at the bottom came back much more slowly and much less completely. And by the way, the same thing has happened over COVID. If you look at the jobs that were lost and the jobs that have come back, it's the same kind of story. So I think the elites have very much taken care of themselves, and I think they engage in identity politics on the cheap. As was already said, there's no cost to them to getting behind transgender bathrooms, and even something like affirmative action. The real fight over affirmative action are about promotions for school teachers and in the fire department and the police department. It doesn't affect people who live in Scarsdale. It's not going to stop them getting their kids into elite institutions. So it's a very cheap kind of identity politics, almost a consumption good for the elites. And it plays out so differently in the larger population.
I think there's a lot of questions. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Sheri. Let's see, maybe the individual here in the striped blue and red shirt, third row.
Hi, thank you. My name is Grace. I'm a master's student here at LSE, and it was stated a little bit in the preamble to the first question, but there's been a lot of discussion about more left-leaning parties moving towards focusing on economics again. Dr. Shapiro, you mentioned Biden's economic agenda, and I was wondering if in a year, per se, if Biden doesn't win the election, how much we can expect the Democratic Party to actually stick with this economic agenda, given that it is called Bidenomics. It's very tied to Biden, and how in recent elections, what seemed to be a very motivating issue for Democratic voters was abortion. I don't know how much economics motivated youth my age to go out and vote. So can we expect the Democratic Party to keep focusing on the economic issue rather than moving back to this identity issue that's motivated both parties for so long?
Thank you. Thanks for identifying yourself. I forgot to say that. Please identify yourself. So thanks for doing that. Ian, that seems squarely directed at you. You want to take that?
Yeah, I think, none of us are good at point predictions about when the next election or whatever it might be. Obviously, it'd be a huge setback if the Democrats lose, assuming it does turn out to be Biden. But I don't think somebody like me has any value added reading the tea leaves about the next, data point. I think the main thing I want to point out, everyone says, well, will Trump come back? Won't he? Will he? Won't he? The point is, if we don't address the basic economics here, there'll be another Trump and another Trump in all of these countries. So I don't have a definitive answer to you. I think it would be a setback, but it is the first Democratic administration since the 60s that is really, if you look at what they've done, is really trying to rebuild the Great Society Coalition. And there's certainly no other path forward for left-of-center parties.
We have a question here on the ends, maybe in the very front row.
David Helenak. I went to the LSE for my master's degree before most all of you were born. I think that one thing is almost missing from every conversation, although it was briefly touched on by one of our panelists, and that is the word taxation. And I believe that Americans, and I'm very simplistic, as you will know, believed when I was growing up that government should pay for itself, you shouldn't run big deficits, and it should be paid for according to one's means. So during the 8 years of the Republican administration of Eisenhower, the highest marginal rate was never below 90%. During those rabid right-wingers, Nixon and Ford, it was never below 70%. It wasn't until Ronald Reagan changed it. And as a result, the questions about education, when I went to the LSE, I'm sorry to tell all of those who are still students, it cost me $110 a term. And it cost me a little bit more than that when I was an undergraduate at Michigan. I think it was $450, even though I was from out of state. And that's because the government actually had some money, because people tax people not to redistribute income, but to recognize, in effect, the benefits they enjoy from being in their country. And so I'd like to hear, no political candidate anymore has the courage to say any of that. Taxation isn't even mentioned in these, but it's completely forgotten, and I think that explains a lot of what we're talking about.
Thank you.
Well, I don't want to focus all, exclusively on the U.S., but I would say that I think what you're saying has changed. I mean, during the sort of Clinton height of the whatever you want to call it neoliberal era, sure, there was an aversion to raising taxes. And of course, the Republican Party, up until recently, did everything possible to avoid raising taxes on the rich. I think this world is beginning to change. There is a significant, albeit, as we talked a little bit about yesterday, weird faction within the Republican Party that has now become very upset with rich elites and corporations, and a Democratic Party that I think does recognize that rebuilding government requires funding. So I think that constraint, which certainly has been there, has begun to loosen. Of course, it doesn't exist in the same way in Europe, where aversion to high taxes has never been quite as much a part of the national pathology as it is in the United States. I don't actually think that is the major constraint on doing some of the things that I think there's some consensus on this panel should probably be done?
I have slightly different take on that. I do think it's almost impossible for any Republican ever to vote for tax increases and not face a primary challenge. And this is the legacy of the anti-tax movement, which I think, along with the civil rights movement and the women's movement, is one of the three most successful social movements in the 20th century of America from the 70s forward. And I think, but I think just to round out the point, the fact that Republicans can't raise taxes doesn't mean they don't spend. And you've seen massive increases in pro-cyclical deficit spending by Republicans having nothing to do with the business cycle, whether it's the two wars. They're the first wars in American history that are paid for 100% on debt. Not a single tax was raised to fight those wars. Medicare Part D, this is free prescription drugs for seniors. George W. Bush, massive $1 trillion over 10 years giveaway to Big Pharma when it's combined with a ban on negotiating drug prices. One of the other things Biden is actually finally undoing. Obama ran on it but didn't undo it. And the Trump tax cuts in 2017, huge pro-cyclical deficit spending program. So they won't raise taxes, but they will keep spending.
Thanks, Ian. You are the person who mentioned taxes, Luigi, so do you want to weigh in?
I think I've spoken enough.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to collect some questions. Is that okay? All right. Questions on this side? Any more? Yes, maybe the individual in the white shirt, please.
So my question is kind of about, my name's Savannah. I'm a second year undergrad here at LSE. My question is kind of about how do you practically implement this suggestion of shifting mobilization to be more around economic than cultural issues? Because, Professor Berman, you mentioned the importance of political actors in implementing this kind of systemic change. But how do you do that? Is this kind of a policy thing? Because like Professor Shapiro said, even if Biden is doing something to do with economics, he's not a great spokesperson. So how do you convey that to people so that they actually care about it? And if it's not policy, is it about media? Is it about how they are conveying what they're doing to the public? Because now politics is kind of given to people in little bite-sized forms via Twitter/X, things like that. So yeah, how do you actually make people mobilize around that, practically speaking?
Thank you. We'll take another one, the gentleman just in front there.
Thank you. I thought that was a very good question because I have, my name is Delbert Sandiford. I used to be an undergraduate here in Keys years ago. But I like that last question because is there a role for leadership in all this? What we have here in the UK, for example, is Yahoo politics. The Tories say that the Labour lot are incompetent. The Labour lot says the Tories spend too much. And you don't get a discussion or a debate around any of this. There's a bit of ambivalence in my question because some leaders, like Hitler, were very persuasive. But we've also had some really great leaders like John Kennedy, who persuaded people, got them behind issues like civil rights, behind issues like going to the moon and so on, very successfully persuading people. Is there a role for leadership in all this?
Thank you. Maybe one more, the gentleman in the maroon hoodie.
Hi, a question from a white, straight, and elitist individual. I'm Rafael. I am an LSE alum. Thanks to the center, there are people from the UK, from the US, from other countries, and it makes for an interesting discussion. When you listen to Americans from academia and from the think tanks, they want the United States to be like the UK. They want stronger labor unions. They want excellent public transportation. They want public health care. But when you listen to what leadership in the UK say, they want to be like the United States. They want to be the Singapore on Thames. They want to be a version of that world. And finally, is there really right and left? Because I see that in reality, there is center right and center left. Like there is no like there is no more like right and left anymore. When you listen to the debates, you can hardly see any difference between Labour and Tory these days. Thank you.
Thank you. Sheri, that first question was really squarely directed at you, so you want to start there and then we'll go through.
Sure, thank you. So first of all, I want to stress that I think this is a long-term process. I mean, the shift from political competition focusing on economic issues and identities to one that is focused also, probably at this point almost equally, on social and cultural issues and identities, that has been a generation-long thing. So I do not think that we are going to solve this in the equivalent of one electoral cycle. But I think both of the things that you said matter. I think putting forward viable, attractive policies to deal with actual economic challenges is crucial. I think that's what Biden has really, really been trying to do, not particularly successfully. That has a lot to do with, again, this sort of generational shift. It also has to do with what this gentleman said, which is, look, I think Biden has actually been a very good leader. He's not the world's most charismatic individual, and perhaps, unfortunately, that really does matter. It also has to do with appeals. It has to do with the way parties present themselves, the way they talk to voters. Again, I think the Democratic Party in the US and social democratic parties in Europe really slipped in that regard also. They were not speaking to people in ways that I think resonated with a lot of voters. I do want to stress, however, because having talked about this topic before, and again, okay, I'm not a guy, but I am a white woman, nobody, I think, is suggesting that social and cultural issues or progressivism on these issues should be dropped from the left. That's ridiculous. The left has always stood for those things, right? The question is, what do you prioritize and emphasize? The Italian Communist Party, just to take your example, obviously stood for secularism. It was not trying to increase the importance of the church or religious values in Italian society, just understood that if it wanted to get things done, activating that cleavage was a mistake. So I want to stress that when I talk about things that the left might consider, it's not getting the left to dump these very important issues or ignore these constituencies. That would be wrong. It's a question of what is the best way of getting everything done, what are the priorities, and thinking about how to make sure that you don't allow the right to do things that are going to hurt everyone, both economically and vis-a-vis some of these other issues.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. The only thing I would add is, political scientists will tell us, well, voters are basically retrospective. That voters don't vote for people on what they're proposing to do in the hope that they'll do it. They look at what governments have done, and then if they have been satisfied with that, they re-elect them, and if they don't, they kick them out. Arguments about campaigning and so on have very little effect, and it's pretty much at the margin. And in politics, when you're arguing, you already have lost. If you look at all the literature on mobilization, it's all about framing effects. Any consultant will tell you, if you talk about taxes for a Democrat, it's terrible. It doesn't matter what you say. And for a Republican, if you talk about Social Security, it's terrible. It doesn't matter what you say. They try to change the subject. But mostly governments have to deliver. And I think that left of center parties and mainstream parties, we've become very US focused here, but in the European countries too, they have to deliver on the sorts of things that address the economic insecurity. If they don't do that, this kind of politics will continue because they won't get reelected.
I think that as academics, the first responsibility we have is to create awareness so that young people like the undergraduate from LSE make the difference in the future. So I think that the first responsibility is to create awareness. The second problem, I think, is the influence more broadly, and this is not just campaign financing, but campaign financing is huge, of money into politics. I think that that is really what is changing. So Biden is kind of a strange miracle because the Democrats, a big chunk of the Democrats, are raising more money than the Republicans. And they don't raise more money by getting from the small people. They get more money from the big corporations. So they're not that different when it comes to the final policies, because money matters. And they made a big deal out of antitrust, and they had a bill, and when a bill had to go to Congress, they didn't present it. And why didn't they present it? Like some people say because Chuck Schumer had two daughters, one works for Google, the other for Facebook. But maybe that's a story, maybe something else, but I think that the reality is that the Democrats are in bed with large business as much as the Republican, even more. That's the problem. Henry Truman, when he retired from president, went and lived in a little house in Liberty, Missouri, and they created a pension for president because he didn't have money to survive. And when Obama stepped down, he was giving like speeches at $400,000 a speech. And now has 3 mansions, one in Washington, the other in Hawaii, the third in Martha's Vineyard, and maybe also the house is not a mansion, but in Chicago. I think that that's the difference in the world. And, you know, people say this doesn't matter. But as an economist, I cannot think that the future payoff do not matter. In a sense, Janet Yellen is a great Secretary of Treasury, but, you know, she made $8 million in the year after she stepped down from the Federal Reserve. $8 million in speeches. Now, my question is, if her monetary policy was not in favor of banks, do you think that she would be so welcome and giving speeches with that? No. And do you think that ex ante this might play a role? As an economist, I refuse to think that that doesn't matter.
Thank you. I've very kindly gotten permission to collect one more round of questions, but keep in mind that you're standing between us and lunch, please. Please, yes. The third row, where did the individual in a jacket and a black and white shirt here. They already went to lunch, yeah. So we'll do this one, and yes, the individual with glasses in the back. Oh, and then one more, the individual here by the pillar. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm glad I'm not the only one keeping us from lunch. But this is a really great panel, and I was really struck by particularly your comment, Sheri, at the end, about thinking through, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. Elizabeth Ingleson, historian here at LSE, assistant professor. Sheri, your comment about thinking through the nature of the relationship between the government and the market, between the state and the economy. And one thing we haven't really heard in today's discussion is the sort of more international context in which capitalism operates now, right? Most particularly the role of multinational corporations. So to how politically, we've heard a lot about sort of domestic politics and domestic responses to populism, but some of the reasons that a place like China, for example, can be sort of a target of populist rhetoric is because it can so easily be seen as taking jobs when often those jobs are the consequence of multinational corporations' decisions and the movement of international capital. So what are the political ways at a multilateral level we could monitor, change, regulate the movement of and proliferation of multinationals sort of collecting so much money in this economy?
Thanks. The individual with the glasses, there he is, way in the back.
Hello, I'm Khan. I'm a recent LSE graduate. I want to ask something very basic. How we define populism. Since 50s, 60s, we started defining populism with economic gradiences, and as some of the speakers mentioned, now we are talking about culture, identities, culture gradiences. I want to understand which way is the best to understand the recent rise in populism, because when we look at the cases in Italy, how we define populism based on the ideological spectrum may not give the best solution. Is there a way to define populism as a strategic rational choice that is incentivized based on what's happening globally and domestically?
Thank you. And then the final question, unfortunately or fortunately, for lunch is the individual right by the pillar. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, my name is Mira. I'm a second year PP undergrad. And I was actually had more of a clarification, but for Professor Zingales, you mentioned about how like the most privileged people somehow victimize themselves. I was wondering what level, like how far back do you go to find the people to advocate for, and whether you restrict that to like citizens of your country or like the global order, like to advocate for the less privileged people?
Thank you. You want to take questions 2 and 3?
Yes. So, to me, and this is, they are political scientists, so they know the definition better, but to me, the definition of populism is, there are two characteristics. First of all, do you trust the experts more than you trust the ordinary man? Okay? And two, do you see a distinction of us versus them? I think those are the two characteristics, and I try to have them neutral so that this is not that one is better than the other necessarily, and this is not the left versus right. And so you can be a populist of the left, you can be a populist of the right, and you can be an elitist both in the right and the left. I think that is affirmative action here. The second is, I think that in every country, this kind of interiorization has taken different forms. And in part, in my view, if you take the United States, the shift in the Democratic Party starts with the Vietnam War. And why? Because, first of all, at the time, people were forced to go to war. And so if you're young and you're forced to fight, you want to revolt. Whether you're rich or poor or left or right, you don't want to fight. And so the anti-war movement was very important in bringing a lot of the upper class into the Democratic Party that was not traditional. And at the time, the unions were actually pro-war. And so that started to create a divide between the blue-collar workers that were traditionally the base of the Democratic Party versus the upper level. But I think there was a strategic use also of issues as product differentiation. If the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have the same donors, and as a result have the same economic policy, how do they motivate people to vote? They have to differentiate themselves on another dimension. And so abortion, gay marriage, all this stuff is phenomenal because it gives them the opportunity to differentiate without touching the wallet. And that's, by the way, the reason why corporations love this stuff. Because I can be super woke and at the same time have my wallet full with my last paycheck. So the two are phenomenal.
The first question was squarely at you, Sheri, and then I'll give Ian the last word.
I just want to start off by saying that one of the most hopeful things that I've personally experienced on this topic is seeing someone from the Chicago Booth School of Business talking like this. So there's hope. But let me just say, look, I think this was a great question. I forget where it came from, which is that if we want to think about how to reform capitalism, make it more compatible with democracy, this is something that has to happen at the domestic, the regional, European, let's say, and international level. Again, this was something that was distinctive, I think, to the post-war period, to learning from the tragedies of the Second World War. It's nothing to focus your mind, like a really horrible war and a Great Depression, that these three levels needed to work together, that the institutions, that the arrangements that existed at all three needed to kind of work together if you wanted to create particular type of outcomes, right? So that's the way, policymakers in the West saw it after the war. Now, again, I'm talking about the West, so, take that with with that limitation. So absolutely thinking about how the international order needs to be revised to help correct these problems, not just in the West, but in the global South. Those things need to be integrated. I want to just say one last thing, which is actually the populism definition, yes, it's a mess. I particularly think, again, following Lewis a little bit, it's a very clear anti-establishment, us versus them, but I focused on right-wing populists because those are the ones, weirdly, who have benefited most from this crisis, You might have thought it would have been the left, but it wasn't, so they are the ones that I think I focused on, but the term is broad. The last thing I want to say is, the funny thing is, Louis, which you know better than I do perhaps, is that this research about parties being most responsive to wealthy and corporations, that's obvious in the US, but economists have done research on this. It's true in Europe as well, right? So the money in politics is important in the US, but there's a deeper systemic problem here, which is that parties, even those not dependent on the kind of crazy funding system we have in the US, are more responsive to wealthier individuals in Europe. And so there's something deeper going on here, a deeper crisis, I would say, of representation that populists are certainly thriving on.
Thanks, Sheri. Last word.
Yeah, so 2 points. One on where does all of this go back to? I think particularly in American politics, there's a history of innovations being dreamed up by the starry-eyed left and then being hijacked by the cynical right. And primaries is a good example of this, but identity politics is as well. Where does this start in the US? It starts basically within the civil rights movement in the fight between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Martin Luther King's ideology was rub the noses of the elites in their own hypocrisy, make Americans live up to their professed public values, and deliver for African Americans the benefits of the American dream. And Malcolm X came along and said, no, he said, multiculturalism. We don't want we don't want integration. We want recognition of separateness. And I think that was the beginning of the search for a different kind of racial politics. And just going back to Sheri's earlier comment, which I think I endorse, the Martin Luther King is a way of pursuing race issues within the context of the broad Great Society Coalition. If you start to engage in multiculturalism, you open up fissures within that natural constituency, and it turns out that the right is much better at identity politics politically than the left, and they, are laughing all the way to the bank with it. Final point. Yes, all political parties are massively responsive to business interests. This is much more obvious now with left-of-center parties because they didn't used to be, but now they are. And it's, of course, in many ways not surprising with the labor movement so far back on their heels in all of these countries. The power of business in the political economy has never been greater. And my book, The Wolf at the Door, which has been mentioned, in many ways is aimed at business elites because, if you compare the world we're living in now to the world after the Depression, in the world after the Depression, a lot of, not all, but a good number of economic elites realized that there were going to be people who were badly hurt by the machinations of the economy for a long time to come. There was a communist alternative out there vying for hearts and minds. They were very influential in things like the AFL-CIO in the US. And the sort of Averell Harrimans of this world thought, yes, we want to make sure, they were also Keynesians, but we want to make sure that the working class doesn't conclude they have nothing to lose but their chains. I think one of the ways in which these elite arrogance has played out since the collapse of communism is, capitalism's the only game in town now. People have nowhere to go. They need to, this is the kind of neoliberal outlook. People just need to shape up and get with the program. And if they don't, it's their problem. We don't have to worry. We can move to the suburbs and build more prisons. And I think that the big wake-up call of politics since 2016 has been, actually, there are a lot of ways in which politics can play out that business elites are not going to like. Trade wars, massive constraints on immigration, things that are not good for business. And, you know, just to end with a shout out to Darren's talk last night, unless, you know, business elites need to realize that promoting inclusive growth rather than growth that isn't inclusive is in their interest, because otherwise the kind of ugly politics we're all now living with is going to continue and get worse.
Thanks, Ian. I know there are lots of unasked questions, so I apologize for that. But hopefully we can continue the conversation over lunch, which will be served in the back. We'll reconvene here at 2. Thank you very much to the panelists for an amazing talk, really interesting. I learned a lot. I hope you did as well. Luigi, Ian.